My name is Gene Anderson. I'm long retired professor of anthropology at the University of California at Riverside. I taught there from 1966 to 2006, and then I was up at the University of Washington for a few years, and then I came back to Riverside and have been emeritus and thus kind of doing a few things for UCR. I'm still working a little at UCR, but basically that's been my life essentially. And I got into China way back from the beginning. My parents were interested in China, and so we had some little kid books about China when I was a little kid, and I just sort of fell in love with it and was fascinated with the culture. And so when I eventually got to grad school as an anthropologist, I decided to, do my research in Hong Kong. We had a professor who'd been there and done some research, and we had some other, a number of China experts at UC Berkeley. I was a Berkeley student, and so I did rather more than a year of field research in Hong Kong in 1965 and 66, working out in the New Territories. I was about 20 miles from the urban area, and at that time that was pretty remote and isolated, and you communicated with the city by a rickety old bus. Now it's all part of the city. It's one great big urban sprawl. But then we were in a very traditional society there. I was studying primarily the fishermen. I was working on fisheries development. Mm-hmm. So I lived on a small boat with my wife and kid, and did a lot of interviews. And I found out a lot about fisheries development, which turned out to be kind of useful. But what I really found was that with the Cantonese, if you start off asking about fish or kinship or politics or religion or anything, you wound up with food. And everybody was kind of obsessed with food. They talked about food all the time. And so I found out more about food than about any other one thing. So I naturally wrote that up. And that was kind of interesting because there wasn't that much published on Chinese food at the time. This is all in connection, I think, with Chang's book, Food in Chinese History, which by that time I audited a course with Casey and also been mentored by Ed Schaefer at Berkeley. And so they kind of tapped me to do it, or my wife and me actually, to do a chapter on modern Chinese food for the book. So we did. And that eventually led me to write a whole book on Chinese food. And then that led me to write a couple more books on Chinese food. And I'm still researching it. And in those days, not that many people were doing that. So what I mostly do is work on cultural ecology and human ecology. Basically, I'm a human ecologist, not a China expert at all. And so what I've done is largely work on ecology of food and nutrition. And that's led me to quite a few places. I'm not a China scholar so much as somebody who works on food-related issues all over the world. I've done a good deal of research in Mexico and in British Columbia. And anyway, when I started out in this food field, there weren't that many people. Casey John and Ed Schaefer kind of developed the field of Chinese food studies as a Western historical thing. And then meanwhile, François Savant in France got into it. And so we fairly quickly discovered her work, and I got to know her. She's a pretty good friend. I haven't heard from her in a couple of years, but we bounce ideas back and forth. And then slowly people began to accumulate, and then all of a sudden, as food studies has gotten to be kind of a big thing, and people are interested in food history and so on, Chinese food has exploded as a field for historians and culture experts and people to look at just over the last 10 or 15 years, which is of course great for me because they're all kind of willing to kind of take me on board. They're mostly much better scholars than I am, but I'm sort of venerable and white-bearded. I'm what in Central Asian Turkey you could call an aksakal, a white-bearded one, which means a venerable elder.
So your focus on on anthropological fieldwork on modern China for the volume that Casey Chang edited, and then right. I guess did you then moved on to historical issues as well. So you looked at the sort of longue durée, the kind of dynamics over time in terms of China's food system. Did that come as a sort of natural progression of your work, or a deepening of your engagement with Chinese food, or how did that development come about?
Well, I'd already been working with Paul Buell for several years. And we got to know each other in 1960 and discovered China. And I sort of introduced him to China and China studies and Central Asia. He got converted. So he became a Central Asianist largely. And so we've just been together, been working on stuff together for all that time. So that's basically where the history, I mean, I've always been interested in history. And I've always had a kind of process view of these things. And I'm also interested in archaeology. I mean, as an anthropologist, I was trained in archaeology, and so I've worked some with archaeologists on this.
Okay, that's fantastic. So then, how did that change your research process? I guess you had a partner in Paul in terms of bringing together some material. Perhaps you even had a chance to maybe compare translations, etc., of certain things. Maybe look at the archaeological evidence that was coming out of China from the 70s. Did that sort of change the way that you did Chinese research on China, or was it more of a slow evolution of how you were doing things anyway?
No, it changed it a lot because he's really good with the languages. He's very good in classical Chinese. He can read Mongolian. He can read all the Turkic languages. He can read some Persian. And so I rely on him for really all the serious linguistic stuff. Okay. And I can kind of vet his translations, but I just don't do classical Chinese. So I've worked with some other people. I've had students who are fluent in that and have helped me with translation and so forth. But yeah, the historical slant is mostly from Buell and me doing joint projects. And otherwise, I mean, my work on China, I continue to work on fisheries development in Malaysia and Singapore, and then in Hong Kong again with Chinese fishermen. And then I sort of drifted off into studying fisheries development in Canada for irrelevant reasons. And then, my career has been kind of disunited as far as area goes. It's united around studying food production and consumption. Mm-hmm. I got streamed into studying the Maya Indians of Mexico because my department got this huge focus on it. We're now like the leading Maya studies place in the country. And so I spent 25 years studying Maya agriculture, forestry, and food, and I published some books on that. That, and then when I retired, I kind of got back to China for various reasons, mostly who was around that wanted to work with me.
Right. So the break sounds significant, but I think you were keeping your hand in your fabulous articles in Jacqueline Newman's wonderful Flavor and Fortune throughout this period, I think, and also, of course, your work with Paul Buell on Soup for the Khan. That fantastic translation of Se Hui's book. So clearly, there was still a passion there burning away, even though you had to turn your attention to another region.
Sure, I always kept up. And we had a really good China group here especially back when it was much easier to get around in Southern California before the traffic completely paralyzed things. So you couldn't just go for the day to Irvine and UCLA. And so back in the 1980s, especially, I was working a lot with Philip Huang, the history professor over at UCLA, who worked on agriculture and ecological issues. And we produced some students and had a good time. So I guess that was really before I got diverted into Maya studies, but it was, I kept up that connection some.
Okay, so really the kind of the ecosystem around California also helped you to kind of stay connected to the China work, it sounds like.
And apart from the food, there's environmental history to look at. And so I had some connections, not nearly as much as I wanted, with Bob Marks down at Whittier College and a lot of other people who are doing Chinese environmental history.
So your food environment in early and medieval China, I guess that was the sort of I guess the key return text, was it? Or I know you obviously contributed to a lot of Jacqueline, for example, website, etc. But that was the kind of key, I guess, the key moment where you did return with some force to China studies.
Well, actually, I had already returned to China studies. That book resulted from talking to Victor Mayer, and Victor Mayer sort of I forget exactly how he put it, but he sort of sowed the seed of writing something about food and environment in Chinese history. So I figured, yeah, I really should do that. I have some stuff about that. So that was kind of Victor Mehr's idea. And so University of Pennsylvania Press, which is, of course, Victor is at UPenn, so they published it.
Fantastic. It feels like there's been a bit of a lifelong drive to ensure that some of the lessons that we can learn from Chinese agricultural systems and its some of the sustainability issues that come out of a deep study of China's food systems, it seems like that still drives you to some extent to produce research and to kind of tell this story in these different ways. Would you say that was kind of a fair assessment, or?
Right. Yeah, I've always been driven by, my main drive all my life has been to try to get people to be more sane and sensible in the way they use the environment. And traditional Chinese agriculture was pretty good. They did some damage and did some good stuff. And it led me to finding out more about some of the minorities of South China and also Southeast Asia. And also I found out about permaculture, this idea of Bill Mollison to take traditional Chinese and Southeast Asian agriculture and develop it as a modern agricultural technique with various modernizations. So I'm kind of I haven't done anything with it myself, but it's a nice example of the sort of thing I want to see, people modernizing the traditional ideas that actually worked. And what's happened instead is that China especially, but also increasingly Southeast Asia, picked up the worst of the West, extremely polluting, energy wasting monocrop agriculture. And they've lost this incredibly balanced polycultural system, which used to be so efficient and effective. I published a bit on, I published a fair amount on that. I intend to do a lot more with it in the next few years.
Oh, fantastic. So then I guess that leads me to a question about the place of, Chinese food studies or food studies in Chinese studies, in the broader Chinese studies. I mean, do you find that the place of food has changed over the course of these decades in terms of studying China as a country, as a history, as a culture, as a society?
Absolutely. Taking food seriously in history began, of course, with the French. Who else? And especially with the Annales School, the school that formed around the Annales of Economy and Society. I forget the total title, back in the 1920s. And I was a great devotee of, Buell and I both are great devotees of Annales history. And that's led me in some other directions, but not to get into that. It started making people look seriously at food history. And you get people like Jack Goody, who was a very important mentor and influence in my life. And Francesca Bray, who I barely know, but she was an influencee of Jack Goody, and Francois Sabon, independently from the direct French line from the Annales and so forth. And so you had a few people looking at food in general and Chinese food in particular, but it continued to be kind of a minor thing because most historians that weren't influenced by the Annales school thought that food is silly and uninteresting and unimportant, and history is about kings and battles, to oversimplify. But really, it was mostly about elites and politics and wars and stuff. And this kind of looking at ordinary life, which the Annales people made into a big deal. Of course, anthropologists all loved it, but historians didn't always. So slowly, food history caught on. It caught on especially in England and France. And then, there was kind of a huge rush into that field in the 1990s for whatever reason. And that really got a huge rush of Chinese food history going. So it's kind of a development within the field of history. In anthropology, it's sort of similar, that food anthropology was considered kind of trivial and not that important and so on until the 60s, 70s. We started our what we used to call the Council on Nutritional Anthropology. It's now the Society for the Anthropology of Food and Nutrition. I think we started that in 1975. And so when the field got, self-conscious, and the original group of us that formed that, we could fit comfortably into a room. It was about 25 people, I guess.
Right.
Now there's hundreds of members. So food studies, and there's several journals of food studies, serious social science journals of food studies now. So it's a big deal. But it's interesting, kind of fun to watch this and watch it get taken seriously.
With that, then, I guess my next question is what you see as the future of food studies for Chinese food studies. What kinds of things are going to be what excite you now, and what kind of things will excite you in the future as you continue to research?
Just watching the changing scene. Of course, one of the many things that's kind of been fascinating to watch is the steady progression of Chinese food all over the world. Of course, there were already Chinese restaurants in California 150 years ago, but there are more than ever now. And if it weren't for COVID, we'd have still more of them starting up. And so there's now a whole interest in the Chinese diaspora and the Chinese food diaspora. So that's one thing that's coming. Another, of course, China is getting richer, or it's developing a rich class. And there's all kinds of conspicuous consumption and enormous consumption of stuff, and a lot of kind of nostalgic eating, people trying to recapture the golden age of eating in various cities. That's something that a lot of Chinese researchers are studying now, kind of looking at what happened to my city, and I think another thing is just going to be this ecological issue. Food production is reaching a rather desperate point in China where urban sprawl and poisoning of the land by chemicals and so forth is eating up farmland very rapidly. And pollution and other things are damaging the agricultural system. It's not a sustainable situation. Chinese agriculture is going to be in desperate shape in 20 years. So they're worried about it. They're trying to buy up land in Africa and places, and they're developing, really tight import relationships with Australia, New Zealand, and so on. That's what a lot of this Belt and Road thing is about. They're trying to make sure they have a source of raw materials, including food. And in general, this whole issue of sustainable food production systems is going to start really biting in about 30 years, when modern high-tech, high-chemical input agriculture reaches a limit.
Do you think you'll find there'll be a new audience for the work that you've done and the work that you continue to do on the history of sustainability within the Chinese agricultural system? Or do you think there's a different kind of reckoning, especially in China, regarding its own sort of agricultural history? What do you think might be coming down the pike?
There is all of, the Chinese are certainly very concerned about the environmental issues and very interested in sustainability. And some of them are seeing wisdom in the old Chinese systems, and others are looking for new systems. And I suspect that there will be more of these kind of hybrid systems like permaculture that use traditional Asian ideas in more modern contexts.
Is there anything else that you might want to share with us? Any anecdotes about, for example, working with Casey Chang to produce that chapter in his book, or any other things that have come up in the last couple of decades that might illuminate something unusual?
My most interesting anecdote lately, and this is kind of cool, is everybody has my weirdest and or most embarrassing moment in the field when I was really green and didn't know what I was doing. And for me, it was in Hong Kong in 1965. We had to go and buy water from a local standpipe. And so I go off with my bucket to get the water. For 10 cents, you got enough water for a day. And, the standard Cantonese greeting is, "Where are you going?" And so it is, "Where are you going?" And I said, a couple of times I said, "To buy water." And I got these really weird looks. And I realized something is terribly wrong here. So I asked my field assistants, and they explained that the only time you say buy water in Cantonese is when you're getting water to wash your parents' corpse.
Oh,
and I know, good grief, this is an interesting usage. But then I find in a recent study that this is known from the Sung Dynasty as a Thai custom. The Zhuang Thai speakers, they have that same usage, and this is one of the many proofs that the Cantonese are just basically Thai-speaking people who converted to speaking Chinese in the Tang Dynasty. Because this custom, as well as several other really weird, interesting local customs, just carried over. It's fascinating. It totally blew my mind.
Wow. Amazing. I suppose you stopped answering the question in the same way after you found out.
I had to start saying, I'm going to get water, going for water.
Yeah, something else, anything else. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jean. It's been a pleasure to speak to you today.